On the left, top left, is that a photograph of the holes G and H in the driver's headrest taken from a perspective that's outside the vehicle?
It is.
Okay. And the photograph to the right of that one now has those same two holes, but this time with a trajectory rod inserted. The G label is now no longer there, but the H label remains. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And lastly, this is an up-close photograph of holes G and H. Now, based upon your examination of holes G and H through the photographs, what did you notice about those two holes?
In particular, that both of them appear to have an irregular quality to them. H logically is an exit, but G doesn't have what I would expect for a very shallow angle impact approaching this leather. It appears to be irregular also, meaning that it hit something else before it got there.
And showing you what was admitted as exhibit number 349, I want to just bring your attention to this because it's one of the few pictures that has both in it. But trajectory rod, the pink one that's associated with holes E and D, as well as the butt end of the trajectory rod through G and H, you'd agree are on different trajectories. Is that fair to say?
From this vantage point, it appears that yes, there's certainly some divergence from this vantage point.
Okay. And from the vantage point of the next photograph, would you agree that it is also appears that way?
It does, but this is where photographs are very difficult to work with regard to trajectories. In fact, one of the things that I go over in the classes is how to photograph the trajectory rods in place so that they are viewed as accurately as possible, meaning for azimuth trajectories directly above them, for vertical directly from the side. And while these are good demonstrative photographs, they don't necessarily give you a good perspective to evaluate that relative to each other.
Understanding that the photograph may not be the best representation, were you able to conclude, or did you form an opinion as to whether the bullet that traveled through holes E and D could have caused the damage to pillar B?
No, I don't believe they do for multiple reasons.
Okay. And one of the reasons, as we discussed before, was the shape and the condition of the bullet that was recovered from Mr. Freer's right forearm. Is that correct?
That's correct, in addition to the very shallow wound path in that arm. So all of those things together build that trajectory very nicely.
Now, referring you to the bottom of exhibit number 349, that shows the trajectory rod coming out of hole H and into what you described earlier as impact sites B and C.
It does.
And B, impact site B specifically is that the metallic portion of the pillar?
It certainly appears to be, yes.
Okay. Showing you exhibit number 350. That's the photograph that shows B and C together. And below that, they're split up. The damage at impact site C is what?
That's through the trim overlaying the metal, and it is, again, an irregular entrance. It certainly has a large portion above it. It does not, in my opinion, appear to be a stable projectile.
And that the significance of that being that that's consistent with a projectile that had struck something prior to reaching impact site C.
Agreed. Correct. And it's worth noting that that headrest at the driver's side position where I see the holes documented in the crime scene photographs in comparison to my exemplar headrest does not strike plastic. So I wouldn't expect any significant damage, deformation, or even necessarily instability from just going through that little bit of leather and foam in the driver's headrest. It really met very little resistance to its passage there.
Now, as part of your examination of this case, did you discover or learn that 2 other pieces of ballistics were recovered from inside the vehicle in connection with this case?
I did.
Okay. And could you describe for the members of the jury what those 2 additional pieces of ballistics were?
One is a very small portion of lead core, a fragment, which I believe is item 9, as I recall, which was recovered from the left side rear door handle area. And the other one is just a jacket fragment. So again, this is a steel jacket with a copper wash on it, which, as I recall, was recovered from the rear seat area of the vehicle.
In addition, other than the damage to the inside of the car that you've already described for us, holes E and D, holes G and H, impact site B and C, impact site A, was there any other damage inside the car that was consistent with ballistics damage?
Yes.
And what was that?
2 items, the left rear window, which is tempered glass, as well as the vertical rear metallic frame portion of the left rear window.
Referring you now to the sheet in front of you, what's shown on that sheet?
The top photograph shows that slight bend in the left rear metallic frame of the window, which is designated as F in the crime scene photographs. And the 2 middle photographs are, I believe, the recovery locations of the 2 fragments that I mentioned, and the 2 bottom photographs are my photographs of those fragments.
Your Honor, at this time I'd offer that sheet as the next exhibit.
Is that a single?
One
Yes.
single sheet, yes.
To be received.
Showing you the top photograph on exhibit number 351, impact site F. And that's on a vertical metal frame on the back left window of the vehicle. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And can you describe for us the damage that you see to the metal frame in that photograph?
And I'm circling it right in here, but it doesn't seem to be picking up the, there we go. It's just a slight bend in that metal frame, approximately 3 or 4 inches up from the lower sill of the window. Fairly nondescript, fairly mild.
And now referring you those 2 photographs in the middle. The one on the left is the photograph as it was recovered in the car on the left elbow rest, the lead core, and then on the right is the jacket that you were talking about?
Correct.
Now, in the bottom row, are those the photographs that you took of those 2 pieces of ballistics?
They are.
Okay. With respect to the core that was found on the left, or purportedly found on the left elbow rest of the rear seat of the BMW, did you do an examination of that piece of ballistics?
I did.
And what did you notice as a result of your examination?
Number one, that it's a very small portion of the core. It is not an entire core by any means whatsoever. As I recall, it's only a few grains. A grain is a unit of measure in firearms. There's about 7,000 grains per pound, to give you a rough estimate. And that it has visually embedded glass in it, which is, again, something I commonly demonstrate in my classes and I see in casework. When bullets, whether it's the jacket or the core, impact glass and break it, that glass really gets embedded in these materials. It's sort of a little glistening, sparkly area, and this little tiny portion of core has that.
Did you examine that piece of ballistics microscopically?
I did.
Okay, and is that how you were able to see the embedded glass?
In combination with high-intensity light, yes.
Okay. Again, if you could just remind us roughly how large or how small was that piece of ballistics?
If it's okay, I'll refer to my notes to get an accurate number. Thanks, sir. Yes, I was right on nominally 2 grains, so very small considering that an entire core, well, these projectiles as a whole are about 158 grains. A jacket could be in the area of maybe 20 to 25. It's less dense than the lead, leaving a significantly greater amount of lead making up this bullet. So 2 grains of that 158 nominal original weight.
Referring you now to the copper jacket, or the jacketing that's to the right of the piece of lead core, is that the photograph you took of that item?
It is.
Okay. And based upon your examination of that jacketing, did it exhibit some characteristics that were important to you in your conclusions?
Yes, it does.
And could you explain for the members of the jury what characteristics you saw in the jacketing that were important to you?
This jacket item also has that peeling back of the jacket around the sides that I was describing earlier. So it's demonstrating characteristics that indicate it also went through a soft damage event, meaning tissue type material.
And is there any evidence, or did you see anything on this piece of jacketing that indicated any hard damage sites?
Yes, there is an area on it that is more consistent with hard, smooth type of damage.
And can you show the members of the jury where you see that?
I think actually there's another picture potentially that has a better angle. And obviously under a microscope it's easier to point it out, but I think we're looking at this area, but there may be another angle or another photograph that shows it better.
Okay. While I try to track that down, if I can you explain to us at least what the hard impact site, how that is different from what you called the soft impact site earlier?
Yeah. Remember that this portion is actually steel, so it's very, very hard metal compared to the lead. So it's going to take up marks from impact at sort of a different rate, if you will. But on one side of it, there's a smoothed out area that indicates that it hit something hard and smooth, such as metal.
Going back to then exhibit number 349, and with respect to Mr. Furtado, I just want to review, one bullet remained in his body. That is one of the shots that he received to his head. Is that correct?
Correct.
One bullet you have attributed to the bullet that ended up in Mr. Friere's right forearm.
Correct.
Is that correct? And the last and third and last bullet is what we're talking about now, the one that exited his head and exited the left side of his head.
Correct.
Is the condition of the jacketing consistent with what you described the bullet as having passed through? That is, the head holes G and H, impact sites B and C.
It is. When we look at all of these things together, the soft damage to the jacket where it's peeling backwards, we need to look uprange for something that would cause that type of damage, and in this case that fits with the head wound that is a perforating or through and through gunshot wound to the head. which would explain why we see an irregular entry into the left front headrest. And then we see that little bit of soft damage at the metal pillar on the jacket. And then the left window right beyond it, where we have broken glass and a small fragment of lead with glass, indicating that it's a good logical conclusion that after hitting that metal right near that window, the jacket remained in the vehicle and the majority of the lead core went on and out into the environment, leaving one piece of little lead fragment with some embedded glass in it.
And what about impact site F? Is the lead fragment and the jacketing consistent with also having struck impact site F?
I certainly couldn't rule it out. Impact site F is difficult to evaluate through photographs, but it is not what I would necessarily expect if it were, say, a direct impact from a bullet, meaning that I would expect a more defined damage site if it were a direct impact from a projectile. So I certainly can't rule it out as being related to that sort of shower of fragments or split up bullet that came off of the B pillar and headed towards the rear of the vehicle out and into the scene. That's a good conclusion.
So when you completed your examination and analysis of this case, did 5 shots account for every piece of ballistics damage that you observed either inside the vehicle or to the vehicle?
Having laid all of the physical portions and their examination out on the table, yes, a minimum of 5 shots. I can account for 5 shots with this physical evidence.
And with respect, is it consistent with all the also the injuries that you saw documented in the autopsy reports of Mr. Furtado and Mr. De Abreu, as well as the photographs that accompanied those 2 autopsy reports?
Yes.
I'd like to just touch on a couple last things with you, Mr. Haag. With respect to the, actually, we'll strike that. Based upon your examination of the photographs and the evidence in this case, what window damage did you note with respect to the BMW?
The only broken window that I observed was the left rear window.
Now, in a vehicle, are the windows, that is the windows to the doors, different in makeup and property than the glass that makes up the windshield and the back window of a car?
In general, the windshield is 2 pieces of plate glass with a plastic laminate between. The side windows and the rear window together are typically tempered glass.
And what's the difference between those 2 things?
Tempered glass is the kind of glass you see that if any part of it is defeated, the whole thing dices or comes apart into little tiny pieces. Whereas windshield glass and plate glass are the kind of glass that if you break it somewhere, the whole thing doesn't come apart. You typically get just cracks right around where the damage occurs. So once it's broken, it's very easy to tell the difference between the 2 types of glass.
When a bullet is shot through tempered glass, what sort of characteristics do you see when that happens?
As mentioned, once it's defeated, the whole pane, that one individual piece, dices. It just comes apart and it looks like spider webs everywhere, a little chaotic pattern, except where that very first defeat of the glass occurred. Where it's first broken, you get radiating sort of spider webs around that, and then once you get a certain distance away from that perforation, it becomes chaotic and random.
And is there something that I have that might illustrate for the jurors what you're talking about?
I believe so.
There's a picture that you actually provided me.
Yes.
All right, and just to be clear, this has nothing to do with our case, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is this a window of a car?
It is.
All right. And what appears to be the bullet hole in the center, could you walk us through that in light of what you just described for us as the type of damage you would see from bullets shot through tempered glass?
Yes, this is a demonstration I do in every class I can remember to illustrate the points I was just describing. The center bullet hole has radial cracks, meaning coming straight out from the center hole, going out in sort of a spiderweb type fashion. This is the primary defeat of the glass. And then you can see subsequent perforations here and here. You can't forensically differentiate or sequence these two from each other than primary versus subsequent. But hopefully this gives you an idea that yes, that primary defeat will give you the radial cracks and everything else is chaos. Jigsaw puzzle, please. And this piece of glass is actually held together with tape. For class, I usually put packing tape over it so that it will actually stay in place. Because it's very common, even while you're working a scene, to continue to hear it crackling and popping if it remained intact long enough for you even to see it when you get there.
And showing you this photograph, that's simply another example of what you just described.
It is, with
And
the
on the-
primary defeat being on the left and a subsequent perforation on the right as you view it.
Now, during the time that you've done shooting reconstruction work, are you aware of any instances in which tempered glass that was broken and then later shattered onto the ground in those little pieces of dice or diced glass was attempted to be put together by collecting the glass from wherever it was and then later taken to a lab, for instance, and pieced together?
The closest I would say to that I've either done or heard of would be when you have the radial cracks, the pie pieces that are close to where a shot primarily defeated the tempered glass. You might be able to figure out where that went. If you're lucky, you may have a wedge that's still in the window frame itself. But no, I'm not aware of any time where somebody's picked up that pile of glass and tried to jigsaw puzzle piece that back together.
Are you aware of any best practices that advocates or prescribes collecting all the glass at a scene for the purpose of putting it together someplace else?
Of tempered glass in particular, not that I'm aware of. With plate glass, you would have a shot, I think, because it stays in big pieces that I have put back together many times. But tempered glass, no, not that I can think of.
Have you ever put together shattered, diced tempered glass?
Not of that quantity, no.
And in this particular instance, did you see any evidence that from the photographs that you saw that there was any portion of the window remaining that had those telltale radiation spidering marks?
In both the photographs from the scene as well as later where it was examined, I think in a vehicle bay, I didn't see any of the radial cracks in what was remaining in that window frame.
One moment here. Thank you, Mr. Haag.
Miss Kitty Bid.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Officer Haag.
Not an officer, but good afternoon.
You are an officer, though.
I'm not.
You're not.
Nope.
Would you work for the police department of Albuquerque?
I do.
Okay. But you're not an officer. You're a civil employee?
I am.
Okay. But you do work with police officers day in and day out?
Fairly regularly.
Okay. And how long have you been with the Albuquerque, New Mexico Police Department?
Since 1998.
Okay. It would be fair to say that most of your work is being done for police agencies?
Actually, I wouldn't even phrase it that way. I work for the physical evidence, and that's it.
Well,
But
when you work at Albuquerque, New Mexico, does any defense attorney come in and say, Mr. Haag, in your capacity as an employee of the Albuquerque, New Mexico Police Department, please do this case for us?
Actually, it has happened on occasion.
In your private practice, correct?
No, for Albuquerque Police Department also, I've had several requests that made it through the chain of command for service
Okay.
requests where I did that work.
Okay, so several meaning how many? Two?
I can think of two,
Two over how many years?
almost 20 with Albuquerque Police Department.
Okay, so two out of how many cases?
With the Albuquerque Police Department, I've never counted them and I don't track that statistic. But quite a few.
Okay. And you did 2 reports in this matter, correct?
I think I had an earlier draft when some items were missing, but one final report.
Well, you did 1 original report that was dated and sent to the prosecutors.
I had a draft that was sent over, and then the final report is over.
November 29, 2015. Would that sound right?
I don't recall dates.
And the second report, January 16, 2016?
That date sounds familiar, certainly for the final report.
Okay. You have your report with you?
I have the report, yes, I do.
Okay. You have the January 16th report with you?
I do.
Okay. And that one came with your CV and all of your conclusions, correct?
I believe so.
And when you say draft, your second report, that was your final report, actually had a lot more in it than your first report did, correct?
I don't remember the different content. I know one of the main differences was that the original materials that I reviewed did not have some of the pictures because I tried to download the materials from Dropbox, but I didn't get all of the original pictures.
Right, so you inserted pictures.
No, I didn't insert pictures. Some of the original crime scene images were not things that I had to review when that draft came out. So once we realized I didn't have, I think, impacts G and H, then I realized there was more information to look at.
All right, so you did an original report. We're just trying to get a chronology here. An original report with not having the complete information downloaded.
Correct.
Right? And then you did a final report that you submitted to the prosecutors.
Correct.
In any event, both of those reports are subsequent to May 2014, correct?
Correct. Everything came out, I believe, at the end of 15 into 16.
All right, and are you aware that Mr. Hernandez was indicted in May 2014?
I'm not aware of any of that.
So you didn't testify to anything you discussed before this jury to the grand jury, right?
Correct.
All right. And matter of fact, you had no involvement in the case until you came up here to, was it New England, to do a course to Boston?
In the Boston area.
In the Boston area. And somebody said, would you look at this case for us?
Correct.
And what was the look at this case for us request?
One of the main questions was, is there a certain number of shots or trajectories that can be accounted for?
Okay. And your final conclusion is that you can account for 5, but you don't know if there's any more, correct?
Correct.
And one of the reasons is you don't have that back window, do you?
I wouldn't say that's the main reason. I would say there are lots of reasons why I have to say minimum.
That's one of the reasons.
I would lump that in with it would be nice to look at the entire vehicle as well as the glass.
And because when you've looked at the entire vehicle, either yourself or when you're working in conjunction with your dad, whose book I have, who you contributed to, Lucian Haag, that's your dad?
That's the first edition.
That's the first edition for us old timers, 2006?
Sure.
Okay. You've gotten vehicles to look at that other crime scene agencies have missed things in, correct?
Correct.
And that's the advantage of having the original car, is to be able to, for you to go through it and see it firsthand, correct?
I would agree that's one of the
Okay.
benefits.
But it is an advantage, and you didn't have that advantage here, right?
Correct.
And as a matter of fact, you asked for the car because you wanted to be thorough.
I believe I knew from the beginning that it was no longer available, so I'm not sure it was an ask and couldn't get it situation, or just I knew right off the bat it wasn't available.
And you knew that you couldn't even possibly regain access to it because it was in the Republic of Georgia overseas, correct?
Correct.
All right, you learned that.
I did.
So there was no way you were getting that car back.
Correct.
All right. Now, let's just discuss, and I'm going to have this marked for ID purposes. Out in the hallway, sir, Mr. Lee and myself came to you with this top diagram, right?
Correct.
And you drew that diagram, right?
I did.
As kind of an exemplar of how guns work in terms of distances?
Particularly gunshot residue.
Gunshot
Yes.
residue, okay. May I have this marked, sir?
You may.
I'm going to show you the top. Okay, would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that is?
This is a general visual aid to help people understand gunshot residue versus the firearm. and what is produced when you actually fire a cartridge. So,
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead, I apologize.
so on the left, we have the firearm in profile view, and then the long rectangular bars that you see here, 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 and here are exemplar witness panels. And this is actually how, if we have a close range shooting event, we conduct that as we put witness panels or papers or whatever our material is involved in our shooting at known distances from the firearm, test fire it, look at the patterns that are created, and then compare those to whatever evidence we may have.
Okay, and this particular item in this is actually a pistol or an automatic weapon, correct?
A semi-automatic pistol, yes.
Okay, and there's something also called a revolver, correct?
Correct.
And when you have a revolver, the gunshot residue actually comes out different areas than the front of it, correct?
Correct.
It comes out, would it be fair to say, the barrel area on the side?
Actually, I could draw it in top view. If you have a revolver, so the barrel is facing this way, the projectile would go up as you're viewing my sketch. The larger rectangular portion here is the cylinder, which rotates and brings each new cartridge into alignment with the barrel to fire. But what that means is that with revolvers, there's a gap right here between the cylinder and the barrel. So besides the residues that would come out up here at the muzzle, which would be similar to the ones in my diagram for the semi-automatic pistol, you also get potential gunshot residues distributed laterally out the sides of a revolver.
And there's also a little gap in the back of that revolver also, isn't there? Where you have the hammer and all?
You do have a gap between the rear of the cylinder and the breech face, but you have cartridges, if it's fully loaded, you have cartridges that block residues, and that area is not an escape or vent for the high pressure gases. So the residues that potentially come out of that area are significantly lesser than the gap.
Okay, but there are residues that come out of the area, which would be back here, right?
There can be.
There can be. And there's residues that come out of the cylinder gap, and there's residues that come out of the front when you're shooting it, correct?
Correct.
So a revolver is a little bit different in terms of the residue than an automatic weapon, is that right?
I would agree.
Okay, and gunshot residue can be unburned particles of powder, correct?
Correct.
And they could also be burned particles of powder, correct?
Or partially. If they're fully burned, then we typically see them as more sooty residues and lead residues.
Okay, but when they're burned because of heat, right?
Combustion.
A combustion. And those gunshot particles can get very, very hot, right?
They can.
All right, because when the bullet or when the gun is fired, it's the combustion that pushes that bullet out of the weapon, right?
Correct. You're taking small amounts of solid grains that when you burn them very quickly, not explode, but when you burn them very quickly, develop pressure that just pushes the bullet down the barrel.
So when you do these tests that you do to see distances on how guns fire, those little tiny patterns, those little dots that we're seeing here and here and here, that's all gunshot residue that's been burned, that is hot, correct?
A mixture. If you look at this portion of the diagram, close into the muzzle of the firearm, you typically have, yes, a mixture of unburned and partially burned powder particles, as well as, again, close ranges, sooty residues and potential lead residues. And as you get further from the muzzle, it's partially burned and unburned powder particles that actually have some mass to themselves that if they strike objects, can't even embed themselves in the object. But the heat aspect of it, as far as looking at these residues on clothing and skin, is a lesser characteristic than them actually just acting like a projectile themselves.
Okay, but they can burn into the area they touch, whether it's clothing, whether it's cloth, whether it's skin, correct?
From microscopic examination of, say, clothing, I don't typically see any sort of burn characteristic with the clothing. It's more they're actually physically embedded.
Okay.
As far
And-
as in skin, I would
I'm
defer
sorry.
to a pathologist.
That's right, because you're not a pathologist, so you don't do wound interpretation in terms of the types of wounds. You can look at the nature of the wound, whether it's round, whether it's a
Counsel.
slit.
If you would, not a compound question.
Okay, you can look at the nature of the wound, whether it's a slit or a round wound, correct?
Correct.
All right, but you are not a pathologist.
Agreed.
And as a matter of fact, a lot of times you have to work with the pathologist to do a wound interpretation to get a reconstruction complete, correct?
Agreed.
Right. Did you ever talk to Dr. Lindstrom, the medical examiner in this matter?
No,
Were you ever given a report of Dr. Downs, our expert in this matter?
I was.
Okay. And did you make comments about that report
I believe so.
in writing?
I believe I wrote on the report.
To the prosecutor?
I believe I wrote on it, and then we talked about it, as I recall. I don't think I ever sent it
Okay.
to the prosecutor.
Do you have that with you?
I don't think I do.
Where is it?
I would probably back in Albuquerque.
Okay. You didn't bring your whole file then, I gather.
Now, what I typically do is
No,
have...
I just need to know if you brought your whole file with you.
No, I have much digital material that I didn't actually print out.
Okay. Now, let's go back to this here, this gunshot residue. This is how it's determined how far the end of a gun, right, the muzzle of a gun is from an object that it strikes by doing these tests, right?
Correct.
All right. Now, that was not done in this case.
Certainly not by me and not by anyone I know of.
Not that anything that you saw in this file, right?
Correct.
But you do know, because you've been dealing with this area, that when a residue or an object strikes, a bullet strikes a body, depending on how close it is, you don't even need to do the test. You can tell some sort of distance, right?
Well, I processed and looked at this clothing and did not see gunshot residue. So from that, when it's not there, you can understand that it's certainly greater than most of the distances where we do get residues deposited. But yes, other than that, I did not form an opinion beyond
And that would be what, beyond 2 feet?
You have to have the gun and ammunition and do that test with as close as possible, assuming you have that, in order to compare the knowns to the unknown, and I did not do that.
But there's certain things that you know about guns that they don't leave, after a certain amount of feet, they don't leave any gunshot residue. They don't leave patterns, right?
That distance, though, depends on the gun and ammunition. It's not a fixed number.
Well, did you have this gun to test?
It would have been here in Massachusetts, but that wasn't a part of what I was asked in this case.
So you were asked to do a reconstruction without being asked to test fire this gun?
Correct.
Okay. And therefore, you can't make any judgment about how far the distance is based on, as a gunshot reconstructionist, based on that alone?
Agreed. And I don't have an opinion on an overall distance.
Now, going back to these particles that burn, okay? If a gun is fired in a closed area, let's take a revolver. Let's take hypothetically a .38 revolver. How far do those particles travel generically?
Again, understanding that the preference is to actually do the test if you're going to come to a conclusion there. I'm giving you general numbers based on past examinations of ammunition, and it doesn't necessarily mean that's the case in this case. But in general, laterally, I've seen it where within 6 inches or a foot, you lose those residues from the lateral gunshot residue. It all depends on how clean the ammunition burns. Similarly, I've looked at those residues next to the muzzle, but laterally distributed, and I've seen it where even an inch out from the muzzle, you don't catch that pattern because those residues are primarily going forward.
Well, you've shot Cellier and below bullets, right?
I have.
And you concluded that these bullets were Cellier and below?
The manufacturing characteristics on the bullets are indeed indicative of Cellier and below bullets.
Did anyone come to you first to say, sir, we think these are Cellier and below, or were you the person who identified what bullets you think were being used?
No, I think I had the firearms report to look at from, I believe he's Officer Camper, and he had already, I think, indicated in his case file that they were S&B bullets, and indeed, in my examination and when I bought reference ammunition, they have a fairly different cannelure to them that would indicate that they're Cellier and below, along with the fact that they're steel, which is not too common.
Well, you said you had Mr. Camper's file?
I believe so.
All right. Did you have his first file where he indicated or where he shot Remington bullets?
No, overruled.
That he shot Remington bullets?
I don't recall seeing that or knowing which file.
So you don't know, sir, whether you had the complete Camper file, do you?
No.
Grounds, overruled.
You don't know whether you had Mr. Camper's complete file.
I would have no way of knowing one way or another.
All right. Did you know that Mr. Camper also determined initially that these bullets could be, the bullets, whatever type they were, could be shot from a .38, a .44, or a .357?
Sustained.
Well, let me ask you this. A Cellier and below .38 bullet that you looked at is not a .44 caliber bullet, right?
A Cellier 38 Special or .357 caliber diameter projectile would not be that other caliber, correct?
Okay. And as a matter of fact, it's not even a 357, even though it's similar, correct?
Technically, this bullet and its weight could be loaded in either.
That's not what I asked you, though, sir. Is it the same size, even though it can be loaded in another?
The two 357 versus 38, they would be similar bullets.
They're different size, though, aren't they?
Not the diameter of the projectile, no.
But the length of the projectile is different, isn't it?
No, the length of the cartridge and case would be different.
Okay, so now we get that the length of the cartridge in the case is different because it's called a 357 because it's different than a 38.
Correct.
Now, when we're discussing how this revolver shoots, also there's something called muzzle flash, isn't there?
There is.
And muzzle flash is what? Tell the jury.
In the discharge of the cartridge, of course, you get lots of residues coming out the muzzle of the gun, and some of those residues and burning gunpowder particles actually ignite and create light at the muzzle, and that's commonly referred to as muzzle flash.
Now, when you say create light, that's a pretty powerful light, correct?
Actually, it really depends on the ammunition. There are some types of ammunition where you get no muzzle flash, and in fact, the subjectivity of even observing muzzle flash, being a shooter, being on the line, and having looked at this actually in projects with my dad even a long time ago, indicate that sometimes it's so brief that one person may blink. If you're not looking at it, it may not be seen, but also that even on video, depending on how fast the frame rate is and how long the duration of the frames are, it may or may not be captured. So while muzzle flash is absolutely a phenomenon that's common, that's observed, it is not an event that takes place every time or is observed every time.
Well, you said it depends upon the heat of the bullet. You just explained to this jury that this bullet is a 158-gram bullet that you were talking about, right?
Grain.
Grain, right, correct?
It is.
And that's a pretty powerful 38 caliber, right?
Actually, it doesn't have the power, if you will, even the muzzle velocity doesn't necessarily relate directly to the bullet because you can change the powder charge underneath it. If we're talking about muzzle flash or velocity, you go back to the powder charge, not necessarily right off the bat the weight of the bullet.
Well, do you have any indication that the powder charge of these fragments that you saw have been changed?
Could you see?
Do you have any indication that the powder charge of these fragments that were underwrote these fragments have been changed?
No, none whatsoever.
So using the standard 38 Cellier and below bullet, is it a pretty grain bullet? Is it pretty powerful?
It's a very subjective term, and even the idea of stopping power is not something that's forensically applicable. So power isn't a commonly described or quantified value with regard to ballistics. It was what I would describe as an intermediate cartridge.
Okay, it still creates this muzzle flash, doesn't it, sir? No matter how quickly or how long it is, it creates it.
No, I would say I don't know, and it
Because you
depends on the
didn't shoot
ammunition.
this gun.
Correct, and even with the gun, some ammunition does and some ammunition doesn't.
Well, you've shot Cellier and below ammunition, correct?
Sure.
Are you telling this jury that there's never muzzle flash out of a revolver with Cellier and below ammunition?
Absolutely not.
No. And are you telling this jury that you can say that this gun loaded with Cellier and below wouldn't create muzzle flash?
No, I'm not saying that.
Because you never shot the gun.
Correct. And
So you can't make those conclusions.
correct.
Okay? So any indication to this jury that this gun didn't have muzzle flash, that's not what you're trying to say.
I would never make that statement.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, when these gunshot particles come out of this gun, okay, and you indicated sometimes they come up a little bit on a revolver, okay, did you do any testing of this gun to see how far they eject from this gun?
No, gunshot residue was not a part of my work in this case.
Okay. All right. Now, one other thing concerning this ZZZ photograph, we're discussing that that's a revolver there, correct?
No.
And that's
that-
I'm sorry, that's a pistol, right?
Correct.
An automatic, right? Now, are there different types of .40 caliber automatic weapons?
40 caliber actually is too generic. You'd have to add something to the end. So, for example, if you say 40 Smith & Wesson, or even 10 millimeter technically is a 40, 10 millimeter automatic, then I can talk specifics, but 40 is a little too generic.
Okay. Are there 38 caliber automatics?
There are.
Okay. Are there 44 caliber automatics?
44 Magnum, yes.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, a lot of manufacturers make automatic pistols, right?
Phrased that generically, absolutely.
And can you tell the difference from one to another by looking at them?
The firearms themselves?
Yeah.
In general, people who work in firearms would be able to determine which ones are which by looking at them. There are some that are close, so you may want to get a better, closer look. But yes,
Have you looked at a Colt before?
many times.
And what does the front of a Colt automatic look like?
There are many different kinds of Colt automatics.
And so you can tell the difference between one Colt automatic from another by looking at the front of the gun, right?
Counsel, why don't we be clear on what you mean by the front of the gun?
Well, the part that, if a gun is facing me, I see, that's the front. I'm using that. What do you call that?
Muzzle.
The muzzle of the gun, okay. When you look at the muzzle of a Colt automatic, can you tell whether it's a 38, a 40, 44?
Unfortunately, first, you would have to describe which Colt, because there are many. But next, if you even go to the most common, let's say Colt in 45 or even other calibers, that profile has been mimicked by many other companies. So I would say we don't have enough information for me to say one way or another, yes or no.
Okay, but you can tell a difference between a Colt and a Smith & Wesson, correct?
Smith & Wesson makes some pistols that mimic the Colt pistols, and so I would say no.
If you had the two guns in your hand, you couldn't tell?
If I had other...
Right.
You are focused solely on the muzzle.
Yes,
Is
I
that
am.
correct? Why don't we make that clear, if you would?
Can you answer that? I'm sorry.
Sure. If all I had were the muzzle to look at, I would not make that conclusion, given the Colt world that I think we're talking about, of 45 automatics in particular. There can be ones of many different manufacturers that have the same profile.
Does a Colt have a flange on the end of it?
I'm not sure what you mean by
On
a
the muzzle?
flange.
Does the muzzle go out?
I'm not sure what you mean.
All right, let's move on to another area. Now, you said you conclude that there's at least a minimum of 5 shots, right?
Correct.
Now, did the government ever tell you that Mr. Brian Kwan heard 6 shots?
Not that I recall. It may have been in depositions I read.
How about a grand jury? Do you recall reading that?
I don't recall off the top of my head.
Did the government ever tell you that Mr. Goins, an eyewitness, heard 6 shots?
Not that I recall.
Did the government ever tell you that Mr. Sanchez, a person seated in the back of this car, heard 6 shots?
Again, I may have read that. I don't recall specifically.
Did the government ever tell you that a Mr. Ferrari, a passenger in the back seat of the car, had a graze wound on his left forearm?
We did discuss that, actually, I believe, when officers brought evidence out to Albuquerque for me to look at, and I subsequently did receive medical reports regarding that.
So you knew that the medical reports of Mr. Ferrer twice had a graze wound in the left arm?
My recollection was that it's mentioned as a graze in one location, potentially an abrasion in the other, that from conversation with the investigators that were in Albuquerque, it was even a minor wound. I'm not willing to say whether it is a bullet graze or not, but I am aware of it, absolutely.
Okay, well, let me go further on that. Are you aware that the medical records had the graze wound twice and abrasion once?
Not that I recall. I thought
Okay.
it was one and one.
Now, when did this conversation with the officers take place?
As stated, this would be when the evidence came out to me in Albuquerque, as I recall.
Which
That's
is
the first
when?
time. November of 15, I believe.
November 2015? Okay. And did the officers, and you also stated, by the way, that you had the reports in this matter, correct? The police file?
Pretty broad. I think I described which documents I had, so yes.
Well, did the officers, when they discussed this graze wound with you, give you a report of Eric James, who actually took the clothes from Mr. Ferrer at the hospital?
I don't recall off the top of my head.
Did they tell you that he indicated on his report that the victim was grazed by a bullet on his left forearm?
I don't.
Why don't you rephrase that question, if you would, Ms. Kindergarten?
Did you know that one officer had indicated, the one officer who took Mr. Ferrer's clothes, that he had been grazed on his left forearm?
I don't recall that.
Okay. Did you know that a detective on the scene, when Mr. Ferrer got out of the car, stated that he had been shot in both arms?
I remember discussions about that, and in the end, that wound to the left arm is certainly something I consider, but I don't recall all the different places that I heard it or
Yep.
read about it.
Okay, but you did read about it in medical reports, correct?
Correct.
You did hear about it from the officers, correct?
Yes,
You
absolutely.
did know that it's in several of the officers' reports, correct?
Correct.
And yet there's not one mention of it in your report, correct?
Correct.
where in the 5 shots that you've accounted for is that graze wound?
And, well, I'll start again.
It's sustained in that form.
Okay. Did you account for the graze wound in those 5 shots
I'll
that
see
you?
you at sidebar, please.
Correct.
Now, I know you discussed with Mr. I'm going to remove this. Okay, is that finished with that? All right. You discussed with Mr. Lee the car glass, but before I'd like to get to that, did you see the car that had, or the pictures of the car when you saw it, had sheets around the front of it?
I did.
Had a sheet, I'm sorry, I misspoke, a sheet on the front of it?
I did.
And that there were sheets around the 2 victims in the car?
I do recall those pictures.
Do you teach that when you talk about reconstruction, to put sheets around the bodies of the victims?
That's beyond the scope of the classes I teach.
Have you seen that in Albuquerque?
In Albuquerque? Sheets over the vehicle?
Let's start with sheets over the vehicle first.
Not in this manner, but certainly when windows are open, they are taped regularly with plastic. Beds of vehicles, like pickup trucks, will commonly have similar materials or plastic put over the top to protect them for further search later on, but I don't think I've seen it in this particular manner.
Okay. Have you ever seen sheets placed on the victims in this matter?
In a car, I don't recall necessarily, but certainly from time to time when bodies are in the field, sheets may be placed over them.
Well, have you noticed in those cases that you reviewed where there were sheets, is that after the crime scene work had been done?
The recollection that I have is no, it would have been before.
Okay, so one of the things you discuss in your report is that certain evidence can be taken away, correct?
Correct.
As a matter of fact, I think you concluded that projectiles or fragments are missing or unrecovered here?
We certainly have the majority of a core in particular that we're missing.
And that some of the projectiles or fragments could have easily been removed from the vehicle with departure of the rear occupants, correct?
Very common.
Could have been in their clothing, right?
Correct.
Could have dropped on the street.
Correct.
As a matter of fact, they're very hard to see.
Can be, depending on their size.
Right, and if they're very small on asphalt at night, they'd be very hard to see. Would you agree with me?
I would agree that's a good statement.
Okay. Did you know whether or not, or were you ever told that a street sweeper came through this scene?
I believe I did hear that story.
Okay, when did you hear that story?
I'm not sure if I heard it in the past, but I think since I've been out here in the last 4 days, I've heard that story.
So you've been here, what, since Sunday?
Correct.
And who told you that a street sweeper came through the scene?
I'll see you at sidebar. Ms. Kenny, please.
Mr. Haag, we're back. Now, we left by talking about the street. Take that into account in the report you wrote.
No.
Okay. And would that be because the first time you heard about it was subsequently?
No, I may have heard about it before, I don't recall. In the end, it's not a huge part of the reconstructive aspect. It's a possible way that if something happened to bounce back, as I understand it, to the opposite side of the street, that something may have been removed. Things like that are pretty common at crime scenes.
Okay, so it's common to have trace evidence at crime scenes.
Sure.
And when bullet fragments are there, it's also common to have people walk away from the scene with them. You put that in your report, right?
Unintentionally?
Yes.
Absolutely.
No, overruled.
You actually put that in your report. That is very common.
Oh, it can happen, sure.
Yeah. Okay. And then you also indicated in your report, by the way, that the lack of the vehicle to examine reduces your certainty, correct?
Truly.
Because you really want that original vehicle, right?
It is preferable.
Okay. Now, when we talk about the car and the glass, let me mark 3 items for, if we could. I'll have them identified and then mark them down. Is it?
Thank Counsel, what are you doing, offering exhibits?
Yes, Marcus agrees.
Let's have them identified.
All right, I'm going to show you 3 pictures, 3 photographs. One has 2 photographs. Okay. The first one, do you recognize that?
I do.
And what is that?
This appears to be a photograph of the rear left door of the vehicle at the scene.
Okay. And then the next exhibit is going to have 2 photographs on it. Have you seen these? Let me represent to you that the left one's already in evidence separately.
The left one I don't particularly recall. The right one appears to be similar to the first one.
Okay. And then what is the third photograph?
This also appears to be an interior view of the left rear door.
Okay. And now have these marked there. Or maybe we approach.
If the witness identified them as exhibits 352, 353, and 354.
All right, sir, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 352. You see that?
I do.
Okay, and that's a photograph that you had to work off to form your conclusions, correct?
Correct.
And what did you understand that to be?
The left rear window of the vehicle.
At the scene?
It certainly appears to be.
Okay. And then photograph 353, the right side is another copy of what you just saw, 352?
It appears to be the same photograph.
And this photograph on the left, do you see that? Can you see the glass there?
I do.
Now, do you notice, sir, that the glass at that point seems to be less than the glass on the right?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. The one on the right actually may have more glass as far as I can tell.
Well, that's correct. One on the right has more glass.
It appears to.
Okay, and I don't know if I can, I've not had much success, as this jury knows, with when I start doing this. The one on the right, meaning this one I'm pointing to, the single door at the scene appears to have more glass than here, correct?
It does.
Okay. And I'll show you what's been marked 354. And that appeared to be what, sir?
I believe this is the one that is the, you may want to rotate it 90 degrees to the right. This also appears to be the other way, I think.
Anywhere that's better
There we
for
go.
you.
That's viewing that same door, and I believe you're looking at the inside of that door now.
Now, you had this photo, right?
I believe so.
And you believe that's the car at the crime day the next afternoon?
Based on the background, I would say that's a logical conclusion.
Okay. And you would agree with me, sir, that the glass that's in here, photograph 352, and the glass that's in photograph 354 shows a different representation, correct?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, there's a lot less of it, correct?
A lot is subjective, but certainly less.
Well, sir, if you had photograph 354, you couldn't make any determination about what bullet strike was first, could you?
With all of the photographs of this door, I don't particularly...
No, I think the witness is explaining his answer. You may explain, sir.
Thank you. In any of the photographs that I have of this door, glass intact in different states, I don't see enough information to say I see radial cracks at any one particular point, so beginning or end.
All right. Now, do you know if, considering you've now seen how the glass seems to be diminishing as time goes by for 12 hours, do you know if this glass on photograph 352 was as it was at the time that the shooting occurred?
I would have no way of knowing.
You have no way to know whether any other glass was lost, do you?
Correct.
And if other glass were lost, hypothetically, sir, that could mean that information that you could form your opinion on is disappeared.
Oh, I would agree with that. I think that's the nature of crime scene, and that the door even being opened after that glass is broken, any of that could potentially remove or make that glass fall out of place. It's very fragile.
Okay, it's extremely fragile. So, but sir, if you don't have the glass at all, you can't make any determination about whether there's a radial crack, right?
In the positions where the glass is broken out, correct. I could not tell you if there were or were not radial cracks.
And that's one of the main reasons why you can't tell this jury that there's definitely just 5 shots, isn't it?
One reason is because it's a potential escape vector for any other shots.
Now, when you had all the documents from the government, we've discussed the street sweeper, right, that you didn't have that, right? We discussed how trace evidence is very important, correct?
Yes,
As a matter of fact, your dad wrote a whole chapter about how trace evidence is very important, right?
I believe that's a chapter in the book, sure.
Okay, and one of the things that you can have is something called bullet wipe, right?
Correct.
If a bullet hits your skin, it can leave a certain oily substance on it, right?
I wouldn't describe it as oily, and I wouldn't limit it to skin. It's a phenomenon that doesn't depend on range of fire, but is primarily composed of either sooty residues and lead residues.
All right, and it can be wiped off, that's why it's, right? It doesn't imprint, is my question to you.
On clothing, what we see is it, and even skin, I've done lifts on dead bodies as well, we see that it certainly could be removed, I suppose, but particularly on clothing, if it's there to start with, which isn't a guarantee, you'd probably have to do some work to remove it, but it's not very, very sensitive to removal on most materials.
You can remove it by alcohol wipe.
It's not, especially the lead residues are not particularly soluble in alcohol, so not necessarily.
It's not permanent, is it?
It depends on which surface and your definition of permanent.
Let's talk about skin. Is bullet wipe on skin permanent?
I would not expect it to be.
No. All right, now, one of the things that you said in your report a number of times is that your opinions can be sometimes can be consistent with some interpretation. Remember that, saying that?
I'm sure.
Now, consistent's a very interesting word, isn't it, sir?
It is.
And,
Grounds?
okay. And as a matter of fact, it's not a scientific term, is it?
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I believe in my college career in chemistry, consistent could have been a term that we used in the lab.
Well, I noticed when you gave your report, you said your conclusions were within a reasonable degree of certainty of somebody in the ballistic reconstruction field would make, right?
I believe that to be true.
Reasonable degree of certainty does not mean consistent, does it?
Let me see you at sidebar.
Sorry, prosecutors. The word's consistent with, correct? Okay. Now, when you said consistent with on some of your opinions can be, the physical evidence can go along with that, right?
I would agree with that as a general statement.
Okay. Would there be any other interpretation to any of your opinions?
I would say the best.
Rephrase.
The opinions that you held, that you testified to, that were, the facts were consistent with, could there be other interpretations?
It's always the struggle to phrase a clean sentence that leaves one meaning. So perhaps the best thing for me to do is to say that with regard to the conclusions I reached in my report, they're based on what I observed physically and tangibly, and that I believe them to be based in that physical fact. As far as consistent with, the way I mean that is just that. The fact that the physical evidence that I see in front of me and have observed in photographs, reports, and my own examination indicate this to me, these conclusions.
Okay. All right, that's what I was trying to see, what your interpretation of what you used to this jury. Now, did you ever speak to Dr. Lindstrom? Did we go over this?
I think we did, and no, I have not.
You have not. And do you know, if you know, do you know whether or not your interpretation of the wound paths agrees with hers?
All of the...
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Do you know whether your interpretation of the wound paths agrees with Dr. Lindstrom's interpretation?
If you know, you may answer that.
All I can verify or describe is my understanding of what I observed in the photographs and the reports and the documentation of those things. So I have not had a conversation with that individual.
Okay. Now, let me just go to one final area, sir. With all the information that you had, including what you may have learned in the last 4 days, can you determine definitely that there's only 5 shots into this car?
No, there are other areas that bullets could have gone, but all of the physical items of evidence, meaning the projectile items, the clothing, the photographs of the vehicle, and the impacts that I observed on the vehicle can be accomplished with 5 shots. But others that didn't strike things, I could not rule out.
So in other words, if a bullet went through that car, the 6th shot that somebody has heard, you wouldn't know that because it didn't strike anything, right?
Correct.
And if indeed Mr. Freire has a graze wound on his left arm, that would be a shot you didn't account for, right?
No.
Well, no, if indeed the graze wound was caused by a bullet, is what the indicates.
You can answer the judge's question. I like that one even better.
I would disagree. There's another alternative for, even if it is, which I can't obviously say, a bullet-related wound to the left arm, that it still works with 5 shots, and that's simply because the bullet that went through the right front headrest is also missing about 10 grains of mass. And directly downrange from that is our open window, which is one of the reasons why I would agree. I wish I would have addressed that in my report. However, given our lack of any sort of photographs of that wound to the left arm, I couldn't tell you if it looked like it was created by an intact bullet, a fragment, anything else, but I can't rule it out as that, and I certainly wouldn't say it absolutely indicates a 6th shot by any means whatsoever.
You wouldn't say that it indicates only a 5th shot.
I would say that you can accomplish that even with that wound with only 5 shots.
Well, that's really interesting, since you never looked at that beforehand, right? Until the last 4 days?
No, I recall, as I mentioned, the discussion of that wound back in November of 15, as I recall.
Okay, but you didn't put it in your report.
And I wish I had.
And you wish you had because you were being cross-examined on it today, isn't that so?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we, having this report now, you still say, even with this knowledge, that you still can't account, you can't say definitively there's only 5 shots.
Correct?
Right? Because you do acknowledge that indeed there could be a 6th shot.
As stated, absolutely.
And as heard by 3 of the people that were eyewitnesses.
Or ear witnesses.
Ear witnesses. Thank you, sir.
Anything further, Kamala?
Setting aside for a moment whether the graze wound could be accounted for by 5 shots or 6 shots, you have no idea what caused the wound, correct?
I do not.
Okay. And as consistent as it is with a bullet or a fragment of a bullet, it's also consistent with any other kind of abrasive material coming into contact with the individual's arm.
He's
Is that-
not a forensic pathologist, a doctor, you didn't know? No foundation.
Rephrase your question.
Do you have any way of knowing, based upon your experience, what caused the graze wound?
I do not.
And are you saying that the graze, just are you, yes or no, you're not saying that the graze wound, there's more likely to have been caused by a particular thing than not, correct?
I don't know.
Okay. You heard Ms. Kenny Bodden ask you some questions about the tempered glass. And did I understand your earlier testimony correctly in that in the experiments that you did shooting at the tempered glass, that you observed sometimes the glass would just fall down with nothing happening?
Absolutely. I've been at scenes even where you're standing around working with a vehicle and you hear the glass fall over your back shoulder.
Okay. And regardless of the number of photos that you saw, did you see a single photograph, or were you aware of any evidence that came to your attention that showed that at some point the radial spider-like characteristics were maintained for later examination?
In none of the photographs that I saw throughout the chronology of the investigation did I see any indication of the radial cracks in a photograph.
Now, Ms. Kenny Bodden asked you some questions about bullet wipe. I think there was some discussion about what it is. What is its value to you?
In addition to the characteristics of the holes, particularly entry holes, and this is a test I performed on the clothing, we look for this bullet wipe to help establish that it is indeed a stable bullet making an entry hole. Because if that bullet is stable, when it goes through clothing or wood, other materials, and that material is shucked off and wiped onto the material it's perforating, that's telling us both stable and entrance. So that's what I was attempting to discover chemically.
So the bullet wipe is one thing to take into consideration when determining whether the bullet struck something else before it struck a secondary target?
That's one portion of it.
Okay. And did you find any bullet wipe or evidence strike that? Did you test for bullet wipe in this case?
I did on the clothing.
Okay. And did you find any evidence of bullet wipe?
As I recall, one of the entries in clothing displayed some lead response with the test for bullet wipe. The others did not, but as I said, because you don't get it, it's not surprising sometimes, especially when you have blood overlaying these areas, but it's something I attempted.
And with the bullet wipe that you did observe, what conclusions can you draw from that?
In the end, the perforations in the clothing that I observed in association with where they laid in the clothing generically relating to the wounds in the bodies, I feel very comfortable as far as what is an entry versus an exit. That would have been one extra check that I examined and looked for. So it would have been another component of the examination that would have been nice to see, but it's not surprising I didn't in 3 out of 4, as I recall.
And did it or did it not affect your opinion on anything? Your opinion on any of the conclusions that you drew and explained to the jury today?
No.
And lastly, Ms. Kenny Bodden asked you that there is no way that you could say that there were only 5 shots fired in this case, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And the reason was that there could be other shots that were fired for which there's absolutely no physical or ballistics evidence.
That's correct.
All right. So would an opinion that there were exactly 6 shots fired suffer from the same problem?
Yes.
Okay. Again, because shots could be fired that are completely unaccounted for because they don't leave any physical evidence.
Correct.
So there's a danger in giving an opinion as to the exact number of shots that were fired under these circumstances.
I would agree with that statement.
Thank you.
2 questions, Jack. Mr. Haag, we're going to send you back to Albuquerque pretty soon. In the last area that Mr. Lee just questioned to you, however, if hypothetically there's records of a graze wound, you wouldn't want to take that into account, correct?
Correct.
All right. And so any opinion that took a graze wound into account is not something that you would discount, right?
Discount, no. As I described, I didn't discount it. I don't think I've ever written a report that I haven't looked back on and thought I could have written better. But you have to, if you're doing science, take into account what information is available of that, which we don't have photographs, any sort of documentation of what it really looked at, and be very careful about what conclusions you then make based upon that.
So what are you telling this jury, that if a crime scene is not properly preserved, if the evidence is not properly collected and documented, that it makes your job as a reconstructionist more difficult?
No.
I would say that's true of pretty much any case. Is it begins at the crime scene, and what you document and collect there is a big part of the final product.
Okay, so the answer would be yes. It makes your job more difficult.
I would say difficult could be subjectively interpreted. I would simply say it opens or closes options.
And it makes your job more difficult to come to a final definitive conclusion.
Or even possible.
Or even possible. Thank you. Say hello to your dad for me.
Will do.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
You may step in, please, watch. Very person. Ladies and gentlemen, that's as far as we can go for today. It was estimated that perhaps the witness just on the stand, Mr. Haag, could have taken us till the end of today. but that turns out not to be the case. So we thought we'd see him until 4 o'clock and that we wouldn't be reaching another witness this afternoon. And so that other witness was not available this afternoon. Meaning we're going to stop here and resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Between now and then, put the case out of your mind. Please don't discuss it, don't read, hear, or see anything about the case, don't attempt to learn anything about this case outside of court. Come back tomorrow morning at 9. I would expect we will have a full day, and just for scheduling purposes, it appears that the Commonwealth likely will be resting its case. I don't know about tomorrow, but perhaps Friday, and we'll be turning to defense evidence. And it is the estimate that likely we are still on track in this case in terms of the time estimate we had given you. So don't fret that we're not taking testimony for the next 25 minutes. See you all tomorrow morning.
Your Honor, very briefly before you